Welcome to episode 239 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/239. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist that specializes in recovery from disordered eating and eating disorders, and really just helping anyone who has a messy relationship with food and body and exercise. And Happy New Year. This is the first podcast that I've released in quite a while. I think I released one in late October 2021, and that was a rebroadcast one. And this is the first new episode since mid-October of 2021. And I'm going to do a life update episode in the not too distant future, which will go into a lot more detail on this, but there's been two reasons that the podcast has been on hiatus. So the first is that my wife Ali was in a horse accident. She was thrown off and landed badly. She tore her tricep from her elbow and needed surgery, and she also had a concussion and a misaligned neck and head. And while it finally feels like things are getting better now, it's been a pretty terrible time. And I took 3 weeks off from seeing clients when it first happened. And then after that, I was back seeing clients, but that was really it. And all the other 7 Health stuff was just put to the side. And this is going to be something that will take a while for her to recover from. I think the estimation is about a year to get full movement back in her arm. But the other day she was driving for the first time in 2 months. And so things are feeling a little better, but it was pretty dark for quite a while. The other part for why there's been the lack of podcasts also relates to my son Ramsey and some challenges that we've been having with him over the last year, and especially since the summertime. And in my last life update, I'd mentioned that he was just about to start kindy 3 days a week, and that should give us more time and more space, and things just did not go as planned, and it all went downhill pretty badly, and it meant that we had to pull him out of kindy, and then we had lots of troubles at home. And there's just, because of all that, my focus has been much more on family time and trying to deal with and support him and support Ali. And really, for both of those reasons, the podcast has fallen by the wayside. And as I said, things with Ali have got a lot better, and actually things with Rams have got a lot better. We've had a new nanny that has started this week who has been really helpful. And so I'm hoping that the podcast will be returning on a regular basis, and it might take a little while for that to happen, but the plan is to get the podcast back to being a regular thing, because I do enjoy doing it. I know listeners enjoy listening to it. And so, yeah, that's kind of just what's been going on in my life. And so today on the show, I'm doing my annual roundup, looking at the favorite things from 2021. And for the last couple of years, it's been books, documentaries, podcasts, and music. But for this year, I'm just going to look at books and documentaries. And the reason for that is, like, my listening to podcasts has just fallen off of a cliff. And I find that it's now pretty rare that I put something on. And if I'm going to listen to something, it's usually an episode of Armchair Expert from Dax Shepard. But so many of the things that I used to religiously listen to, so Making Sense by Sam Harris, for example, have just fallen away. And I can't remember the last time I checked them out. So I don't really have much to recommend on the podcast front, just because my listening of them has really whittled away down to pretty much nothing. My music listening has also been less varied than before, and it's mostly been listening to the Discover Weekly mix on Spotify and whatever that serves up to me each week, and then listening to old mixed CDs or mixed DJ sets from like the mid-90s through to late 90s, basically finding old classic albums and mixes on SoundCloud and sort of a little bit of nostalgia of listening to the kind of music I was listening to in my late teens and early 20s. And that's kind of been it. I mean, there is one new mix from this year that has been on constant repeat, and it's by one of my favorite DJs, a guy called Jop Jopsy, and it's called Onderweg naar Morgen, which I believe is the name of a Dutch TV soap, which is where Jop is from. And the description for the mix is a fictional soundtrack for better days. I hope they arrive soon. And it's 3 hours long, and for many days I would just listen to nothing but it, and it would finish and I just start it up again. And since it came out 10 months ago, I kind of shudder to think of how many times I've listened to it. So that's really my only recommendation on the music front, because that's the thing that has taken up the most of my listening this year, apart from, as I said, like Spotify recommendations or old DJ sets. So on the books front, this year I read, I think it was 25 or 26 books in total. Some of these are still yet to be finished, and not because they are necessarily bad, but just because I have a habit of reading multiple books at once. And so some of them I still have a way to go with. Not many, most of them have been completed. And I've started some new ones that I haven't added to this list yet, and will be on next year's list. And of the books, I want to talk about 7 of them now. So my favorite book for the year is called The Great Alone by Kristin. And this was recommended to me by one of my clients. And I had this year got into listening to Audible and listening to fiction. And so this is a fiction book. And it's been a really enjoyable thing to discover how nice it is to listen to fiction on Audible. And obviously it matters who the narrator is and how good they are. And for this book and for some of the others I've listened to, they have done an excellent job. And so this book was really the start of me falling in love with fiction on Audible. And the story is about a family that moves to Alaska in the 1970s, and it's written mostly from the perspective of the daughter in the family. And the father has PTSD after returning from Vietnam War, and he's an alcoholic. And the book is incredibly dark in a lot of ways, or not a lot of ways, in pretty much all ways. Lots of domestic violence and lots of paranoia from him that then starts spiraling. And it really is gripping, but incredibly dark. And basically at every turn, when you think something can't get worse, it typically gets worse. And so I found it incredibly gripping, as I've already said, and found myself listening to it late into the night. I must have got through it in a very short amount of time, because I was staying up till midnight or later just listening to the book. And it is, as I've said, it's not an easy listen. It is pretty dark, but if you like that kind of thing and you like a good fiction, I would highly recommend checking it out. And it's called The Great Alone by Kristin. So the next book I want to mention is Scattered Minds by Gabor. And so I'm a huge fan of Gabor. I think I've read all of his book. And Scattered Minds is a book about ADD or ADHD. And prior to reading this book, I didn't have a huge amount of knowledge about ADD. I had a very stereotypical view of it. And through reading the book, I now understand it much, much more. And I understand how differently ADD can look in different people and how much of a spectrum it is. And what Gabor talks about is that ADD is connected to poor attachment that a child receives when they're younger or into their teen years, etc., and that it's for sensitive individuals, for people who have higher sensitivity, who are much more attuned to the environment they're in and the comments that people make, and especially coming from those who are their main caregivers, mostly parents. And I found this book to be incredibly useful to read from the perspective of understanding ADD, but I also found it really useful just to understand from a parenting perspective, from a development perspective. And it would be a book, and it is a book that I've started to recommend to clients, and even clients who I don't think have ADD, just because of how well it starts to talk about things like attachment and attunement and child development and brain development. and it looks at why ADD traits arise in someone. And then there's suggestions as well of like how to support someone with ADD. So if you are a parent of a child or a teenager, how to be doing that, or if you're an adult with ADD, how to be dealing with that then. And Gabor talks about his own ADD and the ADD of his own kids, and he's very candid about his experience and his role that he played as part of his kids developing ADD. And the thing he talks about is like, it's not about blame. And I do think that this is true. Like every person is doing the best that they can, but he was able to reflect on looking at how he was and how that could be having an impact on his kids. And it did make me reflect on my parenting and how I was parented as a child. And I think it's a good book in that respect of just helping to reflect. And again, even if you haven't ended up with ADD, and I don't think I've ended up with ADD, it's a good thing to reflect on, okay, well, how was the attachment that I got? What was the attunement line, etc. And I do think that I'm not the only one that has a very narrow or stereotypical view of ADD. And so I do think it would be useful for lots of people to read this, even if they don't think that this is something that is affecting them or affecting people in their lives. And so that's Scattered Minds by Gabor. So the next book is called Attachment Play by Aletha Souter. And the subtitle for this book is How to Solve Children's Behavior Problems with Play, Laughter, and Connection. This book was recommended to me by a psychotherapist. So I mentioned at the beginning, we'd been having some challenges with Ramsey, and Ali and I went to see a psychotherapist a number of times to try and better understand what was going on and us and him. And one of the recommendations that the psychotherapist made was a collection of different books. And this was one of the books that she recommended. And I would have to say that it has been a real godsend in helping me and helping me to understand things and helping me to be a better parent for Ramsey. And what the book looks at is the different types of attachment games that you can use and play with a child, and why they are so important for helping kids to process emotions, for helping kids to understand life situations. And so as part of the book, it goes through 9 different types of attachment play. So for example, you could have symbolic play. So play that is representing something that has already happened in someone's life and then trying to make sense of it. So for example, after Rams was going to kindy, he started recreating that when he was at home, and he would then be playing the role of the teachers in the kindy, and I would then be playing the role of the child going to the kindy, and it was his way of trying to process that situation. There's then contingency play, and this is where the child has the ability to do things that then lead to a reaction within the adult. So for example, I could put him on my back and I would then say, okay, if you want to drive right, tap my right shoulder. If you want to drive left, tap my left shoulder. If you want to go forward, tap the top of my head. If you want to go back, tap my back. And he then gets to be in control of that situation. And typically it would lead to lots of laughter. He would drive me into doors or plants or whatever, but it meant that he then had a sense of control. And again, there was a lot of laughter that would come from it. There are then power reversal games. And so for a lot of kids' lives, they are at the mercy of the people who are much bigger than them and asking them to do things, and it's time to do this, or we have to go here. And so power reversal games are ways that they can then, as the name would suggest, be the one that is more dominant and can help to process those feelings. And so for Rams, there would be times where he would have this little toy that he would then tell us are a wasp, and he'd then be stinging us with the wasp, and we would play that it was really hurting, and then we'd be falling on the floor. And again, he would then start laughing, and it would allow him to process those emotions. And the same, he'd pick up a pillow and we'd say it was a magic pillow, and if he hit us, we'd fall on the floor, or he'd put it on us and he'd tell us it was the weight of the house, and it just gave him an outlet for being able to deal with those emotions. Another one is like regression games and allowing the child to regress as a way of feeling safe again. And so for him, there would be lots of times where he would pretend to be a baby, or he would climb up Ali's shirt and say, "You're pregnant again," and then have a baby. And that was his way of being able to process a lot of things. And so it was great to have the understanding of all of these different games and what was trying to be achieved through those games. The book also then gives different examples for certain situations. So like how to set limits, or how to elicit cooperation, or how to deal with toilet training or anger or aggression, and then speaking about the different attachment plays and the way that they can be used in those situations. And with us, like, I want behavior changes to occur for the right reasons. Like I don't want to be shouting an authoritarian and get Ramsey to behave through fear or through coercion or through some means that, yes, we get compliance in the short term, but in the long term it leads to real problems, and then I'm going to really pay for it when he's a teenager or when he's an adult or whatever. And so I want to find ways where it's not only helping us because the behavior changes, but it's helping him because it's changing for the right reasons. And this book has been really helpful in that, because so many of the things that we may have been having difficulty with in terms of him sitting down for dinner at the table, or brushing his teeth, or getting ready for bed, a lot of those righted themselves when we were playing all of these other games. And it was amazing how much, by dealing with these things, in a sense indirectly, because you're dealing with the root cause, how much of a difference it's made. And so for any parent, I would highly recommend this book. It's called Attachment Play by Aletha J. Souter. The next book is The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. And this is a book I've been meaning, or had been meaning, to read for a couple of years. I know Jennifer Rowland mentioned it previously on the podcast. I think the first time she was on, she mentioned it. And subsequently, after reading it, it's become the book I've probably recommended the most to clients this year. And Russ Harris is a trainer in ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy. I also read, and I actually read this prior to reading The Happiness Trap, I read a book called Act Made Simple, which is also a Russ Harris book. And Act Made Simple is aimed at practitioners and helping them to understand acceptance and commitment therapy and all of the different aspects of that, whereas The Happiness Trap is aimed at the lay public. And so a lot of the content is the same, but it's just talked about in a different way. The Happiness Trap is a lot smaller of a book and doesn't go into as much detail. And I really like both of them. I think they're both fantastic books. For a practitioner, I would highly recommend Act Made Simple. I think it's a great book. But as most of the people who listen to this podcast are the lay public, I would highly recommend The Happiness Trap. And so acceptance and commitment therapy is really about creating psychological flexibility. And there are 6 core elements to it. And 4 of them are about mindfulness. I know Russ Harris hates the word mindfulness because I agree with him. I think it's taken on lots of connotations and people think about it, do you mean meditation? And that's not what's meant by this. And so the 4 parts of it are diffusion. And so diffusion is recognizing that you have thoughts and feelings but not being taken in by them. And expansion is the next one, and that's being able to expand and open up to whatever thoughts and feelings arise. The next is connection, and this is then being in connection with oneself. And then the observing self, which is then the ability to know that thoughts and feelings are arising of their own accord, and being able to be more of a witness and being more objective about it. And then there are 2 other elements which are about taking action. And one of these is values. So understanding the values that you have and the values that are important, and having them be a guide for the kinds of decisions that you make. And then the final one is committed action. And that's then the main point of acceptance and commitment therapy is that it's not just a theory. It's about then taking action based on all of this. And a lot of it is around just how much we are hijacked by our minds and we are pulled around by unhelpful thoughts and pulled in unhelpful directions. And some of this can feel a little counterintuitive. Like he talks about, often we're asking ourselves, like, is this true? Like, is this thing that I'm thinking about myself or about a situation true? And what he talks about is like, that's a really unhelpful question, because what should be asked is like, is this a helpful thought to have? Because even if something is true, having that thought can allow you to be stuck, and it can be then an unhelpful thing to be focusing on. And so the question is then like, is this a helpful thought to have? If it is, great, keep having it. If it's not, then finding out ways to move on and put that down, which again is connected to the ability to learn how to do diffusion or expansion, etc. And so I think some of the stuff within acceptance and commitment therapy can be a little bit counterintuitive on the surface, but as soon as you start to understand why the recommendations are the way they are, it does make a lot of sense. And the reason I found this book to be so helpful is before even reading about acceptance and commitment therapy, there was so much of it that I was already using with clients and that I'd found in other areas, in terms of other books or other recommendations. And acceptance and commitment therapy just brought all of it together in a really nice framework. And so it means that clients can then read the book and then we can talk about different sections or different aspects, or when things are coming up, I can say, hey, I think you should go back and read the exercises on expansion again. And so I do think it's a very practical book. I think Russ Harris is great with using different metaphors to help to understand what's going on. And this is applicable for all humans. Like, I got so much out of this book personally. And there's so many of these things that I use in my day-to-day life. So it's not just this is useful for someone in recovery or while in recovery, or for someone who is like in a really bad way, and once you get better, you don't have to use any of these things. Like, this is stuff that you will use for the rest of your life. And so I think it's a very practical book. There are many exercises, and I would highly recommend checking it out. So that's The Happiness Trap by Russ Harris. The next book is The Fuck It Diet by Carol and Dooner. And I bought this book when it first came out, and it must have been 2 years ago, might have even been 3 years ago. I can't remember exactly when it came out, but I bought it and I just never read it. And there are lots of books that are similar to this, or in this same kind of genre, that I think are great for clients to read, but I just never get around to reading them because for a lot of it, it's just not new information to me. And so it's hugely helpful for clients, but it feels like I'm reading stuff that I already know. And so I just, in the end, don't end up reading a lot of these kind of books. But I'm glad that I did. And I would say it is still true with this book. I personally didn't learn a lot of new information, but I did really enjoy it. And I think it's written really well. It's funny in parts. It's very practical. And I'm glad that I read it, because I'm able to say, this is the book within this kind of genre that I would say you should be checking out, because it is incredibly helpful. And the book looks at how to improve your relationship with food, how to improve your behavior patterns with food. It looks at this from the angle of like the physical side. So looking at, okay, what happens when you're restricting or going on a diet. It looks at the biological functions that happen, and that this isn't because you lack willpower or you're not dedicated enough. It's because your physiology is trying to save you. So it looks at like the famine response. It looks at the Minnesota starvation experiment. So there's a lot on the physical side of things. It then looks at the emotional side of things, and this connected to, again, how being in these states of deprivation can have an impact on emotions. It looks at our desire to be thinner or our desire to be loved, or all the reasons why someone gets into a habit of dieting or restriction. It then looks at the mental side of things and how that affects cognition. And then it also looks at the final part, which is the thriving part, which is like, once you're getting out of this place and you're getting to a better place where dieting is not preoccupying so much of your time, or restriction is not taking up so much of your time, what do you really want your life to be about? And what are the values that you want to be living by? What are the things that you want to be able to say and set boundaries around? And so I do think it's a really good book in terms of looking at things from lots of different angles. And I had a number of clients this year that found this book to be a really great help. And I think it was probably that I had a couple of clients in a row who really talked about how helpful the book was. And so I was like, look, I should take some time to actually read this. And I knocked it over pretty quickly. And I'm really glad that I did. So I would highly recommend The Fuck It Diet by Carol and Dooner. So the next book is This Is Your Mind on Plants by Michael Pollan. So Michael Pollan appeared on my favorite book list before. I can't remember which year it was, but he wrote a book, or his book prior to this was called How to Change Your Mind. And I think it was in 2018. And it was looking at the resurgence in research around psychedelics and the path that these substances are now taking to be looked at again, to be used in the therapy session. And it looked at the history of psychedelics. It also looked at how these substances work, or how we think these substances work in the brain. And so this book is really a kind of follow-up of sorts. And it looks at the history and the effects of 3 different drugs. One is opium, another is caffeine, and the third is mescaline. And as part of the book, it really is broken into these 3 sections, and he just spends time on each of these 3 drugs separately. And he talks about his own experiences with taking each of these, or in the case of coffee, what he noticed from coming off of it. And I found it just a really interesting read. So Pollan talks about his experience of growing opium and making opium tea, but it was doing this during the 90s, when there was the background for it was that at the time there was a huge war on drugs, and just growing opium and thinking about turning it into opium tea got him feeling very paranoid. He was going to write a story about it. He didn't know if he should actually release the story, or if he could actually face jail time as part of doing it. And at the time that this was all going on was then when OxyContin was then hitting the market and then being prescribed, and that has turned out to be a complete disaster. But it was just, he was reflecting upon what's happened over all of these decades and how things are now very different. But talked about his experience with that. He then talks about coffee and how it is for him coming off coffee, and what he notices by coming off coffee, and how difficult it was for him to even write the chapter on coffee because of how much it had an impact on his cognitive function to come off it. And the history of coffee I found absolutely fascinating. And he talks a lot about it, and it's making its way into Europe in the 1600s, and then it's used from then on. But just understanding how much prior to coffee turning up, people were drinking alcohol from the moment they woke up, because they didn't want to drink, or there was the fear of drinking water, and that could be unclean and it could cause illness, and so people would just drink alcohol the whole time. And to think of someone who is then working either on the land or working in any job, if you're starting the day with beer or whiskey or whatever, you're going to have a very different situation than if you were drinking coffee. And so, it was quite a fascinating story, and something I didn't know very much about at all. And then the final one is like him talking about mescaline. And again, mescaline's not a psychedelic I know very much about. And he talked about its connection with the Native Americans. Interestingly, it was one of the first psychedelics I'd read about, but just didn't really remember or know. So in Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, he talks about, the whole book is him talking about his experience on mescaline. And I just didn't remember that mescaline was the substance that he'd taken as part of that book. So I found that this was a really enjoyable read, but I also felt like I learned a lot. I think Pollan has got a very easy writing style as for then the reader. And so, yeah, I would highly recommend This Is Your Mind or Plants by Michael Pollan. And then the final book I'm going to mention is The Storyteller by Dave Grohl. And so I've been a huge Dave Grohl fan for a really long time. So Dave Grohl was the drummer for Nirvana. He was actually the fifth drummer for Nirvana, but he was the one who was then there at the end and was there the longest amount of time. He's then the lead singer and guitarist in the band The Foo Fighters. And I'd actually been wanting to read a memoir or an autobiography about him for the last decade. I'd been thinking about it for a really long time, like I really want to check something out, I need to buy something. And then I saw this book had just been released, and it was something that he had written during the pandemic. And so it felt like, okay, perfect. This is my way of starting to read a memoir of Dave Grohl. And the book really just reminded me so much of my teenage years. So I was a teenager in the mid-90s, and just hearing about all the different bands and the different festivals, it really reminded me so much of my youth. I was a huge fan of Nirvana growing up, and really into a lot of the grunge and alternative music that was big in the 90s and then kind of hit the mainstream. And so it was great to like hear about how he learned to play the drums and then learned to play guitar, about him like living on the road in the early years, and then his experience with Kurt Cobain, who was the lead singer of Nirvana, who tragically took his own life. And so hearing about him living with Kurt, and then them creating Nevermind, the huge album, and then the aftermath of all that fame, and then Kurt's death, and then just other bits that I had no idea about in terms of like his real friendship with Sir Paul McCartney, him as a dad, and how he is with his daughters. And Dave Grohl has the moniker of the nicest guy in rock and roll. And reading the book, that just shines through. And he just has so much humility about himself, and just the excitement for meeting his heroes, whether that be Lemmy, whether that be David Bowie, whether that be Sir Paul McCartney. Like, he's just the thing that I took away is like every day he's just pinching himself, thinking like, how do I get to have this life? And he talks about if he's playing at a festival, he just walks around the backstage area and just kind of knocks on anyone's dressing room with a bottle of Jack Daniels and is like, let's have a drink, let's have a chat, because he's just so ecstatic about the fact that he gets to do this as a job. And he's just so incredibly passionate about music and all types of music. I remember hearing him talk about the fact that he heard a new ABBA song and was just in tears because of how much he loved it and how much of a big ABBA fan he is. And considering he was in a pretty heavy band, or he likes lots of heavy rock music, it could seem strange for him to be into ABBA, but he's just someone who truly loves music, and that really shines through in the book. And so for me, it was just a huge amount of nostalgia when reading it and hearing about the inside of certain things that I'd been fascinated about. And again, I think I read this in a week, or maybe even less than a week. It was something that I just was spending my nights really getting into.